Hello, good afternoon in Europe and Asia, good evening in Australia. A very warm welcome to our webinar series, Navigating the Turbulence of COVID-19. I am Anne Eve and I'm the Director of Lifelong Learning here at INSEAD. I see with pleasure that we have many fellow alums on the call, students, staff, some faculty, and a number of guests. It's my pleasure to moderate the topic of today, organizational consequences of the COVID pandemic. Most of us are actually not working alone, but are part of an organization, and the organizations have been impacted and post-COVID need to react, need to adapt to the pandemic. What we will be doing in the next 60 minutes is looking at some of the consequences. Charlie has prepared a great overview and we will allow for plenty of questions as well. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker of today, Charles Galunic. Charlie is a professor of organizational behavior and the Viva Chair Professor of Leadership and Responsibility. Charlie works at the intersection of organizational behavior and strategy, and his research explores at that crossroads, for instance, the foundations of strategic advantage inside the organizations, organizational culture, and then how it aligns with strategy, and of course, the role of leadership. He has taught many of the MBAs on the call. He has been teaching the Managing Organization course. I've been part of this cohort many, many years ago. And it is my pleasure to have him here today. He's a busy person, so we're really, really, really pleased to have him share with us some of his insights today. And with that, over to you, Charlie.
Okay, I hope you can all see that. Let me begin by wishing you all well. I hope you're safe and well during this time wherever you are across the world. I also want to say a thank you to my OB colleagues. We've had a bunch of seminars ourselves over the last couple of months where we've been brainstorming and sharing ideas on some of the organizational consequences of the pandemic, and I'll share some of those thinking with you, not just my own, but for some of my colleagues. And I'd also like to thank very much the participants from current EMBA program and some executive programs for filling out a survey on consequences of the pandemic. Thank you. I'll share some of that back. It was a quick and dirty survey just to get a few ideas about things you're experiencing and some of the ways in which companies are coping with this. So my talk will be in two parts. I'm going to take a little bit of time just to take stock of the context that we're in. I think the context and the environment shapes organizational policies. There's a big cascade going down from government and health experts all the way down. So I'll take about 10-15 minutes. I'm going to race through that. My apologies in advance. Talk about the pandemic, the economy briefly, and emerging health policies. And then we'll spend most of our time on consequences for organizations. I'll talk about 6 different areas there. We'll do some Q&A within that time and leave some time for open discussion as well. Okay, so you are probably sick and tired of epidemic curves. It's the year of the curve, and you've seen many like these. This is one of the websites that I follow, Our World in Data, where we see the distribution of different countries and the total confirmed cases of COVID-19. And generally the news is good. We're bending the curve. What we're looking for here is a nice flat line eventually where the total number of cases are no longer rising. And in many parts of the world, that seems to be the case. Some regions, of course, South America, parts of Africa and India, of course, are still in an upward swing, but in many places the curve is being bent. I guess we know to use these curves with caution. If we change the metrics slightly, if we look at cases per million, all of a sudden a lot of the smaller countries like Luxembourg, Belgium, Switzerland move up and the larger countries drop down. But it's a double caution because some of the reasons why some countries may be particularly high is they're more aggressive in testing. For example, Luxembourg is one of the leading countries in testing, and therefore they're going to pick up more of the cases that are out there. But on the whole, the news is encouraging, at least. So this is a graph of the new cases, daily cases, a 7-day rolling average. And again, many places of the world we're seeing dips. There are some resurgence in places like in South Korea. You've got clusters that break out. And then I think the goal now is to deal with those local clusters and not have to lock down the whole economy, but deal with those local clusters through testing, tracing, and isolation. Keep in mind that these numbers are quite low down here, so it's not a case of the thousands, but more in tens or under 100 certainly. The key parameters that people are following are, of course, fatalities, cases, healthcare capacity, the R naught, the RT, that sort of reproduction number, but also the testing capacity. This is a big concern, I think, across the world now, because it's part of the health policies strategies is to cope locally, and therefore we need lots of testing capacity. And we've been building up that capacity. You can see different places across the world. Luxembourg, Denmark, Iceland, I think, is at the leader of that. Also has a very high COVID cases per capita, but also because they're doing lots of testing. So on the whole, as one health expert said, it's hopefully the end of the beginning. We're bending the curve, but we're not out of the woods. There's still a lot of active cases. I believe just last Friday, the number of closed cases surpassed the number of active cases. But the active cases has not peaked yet and is still rising, and the real numbers are likely to be much higher. There's also a lot of variability as well, right? As I mentioned, different regions are at different points in the pandemic curve, which will lead to uncertainties in travel, in supply chains, and so on. And there's lots of dynamics that we don't know about yet about the virus. And what I think is important to mention is we're very far from anything resembling herd immunity. Assuming that we would have normal antibody protection, still experts believe that we'd need like 60 to 80% of the population to have the antibodies. And in some of the most impacted places like New York City, by one estimate, it's upward around 20%, but nowhere near the levels that we would need. Nonetheless, the economies have slowly started to reopen, because this is the other part of the concern that we have, is the massive shock to the economy that we've faced. This is the fastest fall in output, I think, ever recorded, and the dip in the global economy is expected to be lower than anything in recent memory, as you can see here. The red line indicates the share of countries with negative per capita growth this coming year, and it's also going to take up more countries in that recession. Here's one graph from the IMF, which maps the GDP per capita change expected in 2020. And anything here that's in orange, light red, or dark red would be negative growth, so much of the world. It is an unusual recession. I've been spending some time with one of my colleagues, Antonio Fatas, and it's not normal that we just sort of shut off the lights and see such a drop. He provided this one plot where we can see industrial production in Spain, and the big drop off of 30% is every summer around August. Industrial production stops basically because people go on holidays, and it bounces back up again. And then the question now is, I think economists are debating, what will the recovery look like? Will it look like a V, which is normal for many recessions, or will it be a prolonged period at the bottom and then a jump up, or a double dip, or maybe stagnation of some sort where it's prolonged low growth? Some even think maybe it's going to be more like a Nike swoosh, where we have a fall, a fast drop, but then a slow rise gradually over the years. There is some encouraging news that it may resemble, in some places at least, like a V. For example, in China, the Taishin PMI, which is a leading indicator of economic output, is bounced back, not to the levels that it was, but at least it's moving in the right direction. So overall, for the economy, the hope is that we've kept the engine warm, kept the tires and engine warm. This was self-induced. The fundamentals weren't bad going into the recession. And so hopefully there'll be a lot of pent-up demand that will want to get the economy restarted again. There's been massive government intervention, as I'm sure you all know, quantitative easing in Europe, liquidity, tax breaks, partial employment support, guarantees, loan guarantees, and so on. And the hope is that the health policies will help us avoid a second prolonged wave. On the downside, there is a threat to the economy because of residual damage. If we stay locked down for too long, parts of the economy may have a very hard time recover. Some companies may not survive. Unemployment may grow longer. And so this is a threat. The economy is likely to have uneven recovery. Different sectors will be impacted differently. Of course, civil aviation, travel, tourism, hospitality have all been very hard hit. And there'll be also multiple speeds of recovery. There'll be supply chain variability for many companies if they may have demand in one region, but unable to meet it because of their supply chain issues in other parts. So just like the pandemic, there's a cascading of the effects downwards to the organization to solve their problems, whether it's within their sector and the ecosystem that they reside in, or whether it's to their supply chain and how they cope with that. And over to healthcare policies. So this is a map of the level of government stringency in different parts of the world. And the darker the blue, the more stringent the policies. And what they're measuring here is it's a composite index of things like school closings, workplace closures, travel bans, limits on public gatherings, public transport closures, things like that. And as we can see here, the government regulations are quite stringent in most of the world. Places like Sweden, of course, are less so. The stringency is also going down a bit. As you see in the curve in the bottom right corner, we've probably had a peak around early April, and now things are starting to loosen up again. The way forward, and I'm sure you're hearing this a lot in the news in whatever country you're in, is of course to continue the individual and group behavior around social distancing, hygiene, and wearing some type of face mask. But the hope is around the test, trace, and isolate policies, which many different countries are adopting. So making sure there's easy access to reliable tests to identify cases that we can then trace through technologies, through apps that different organizations are building and countries potentially, that we can identify people who've come in contact with those who have the virus, and then isolation. This type of localization, sort of cascading down the responsibility, will take a lot of cooperation. It requires the virus levels to be low in the first place before this can work. Otherwise, the level of resources we would need would be extreme if the virus was too prevalent in your community, in your environment. And of course, it's very sensitive to the criteria that we'll be using. So this includes duration of contact, it includes the distance, and then the quarantine time. If you change any one of those, it could have repercussions for what eventually gets isolated. This is something Singapore used earlier in the pandemic, which was 30 minutes of contact, 30 or more, at 1.5 meters or less was 14 days of isolation. So it's basically a lunch, reasonable length lunch that you have with somebody. If they had COVID, you'd have to be isolated. If that moves down to 15 minutes or 10 minutes, I think the UK is looking at about 15 minutes. All of a sudden, it has implications for the type of meetings that would lead to isolation, like a long coffee meeting, for example. So that's something also to keep an eye on. But on the whole, again, it's going to take a lot of cooperation from companies to make sense of these policies, to interpret them, to rework their spaces of work, the designs, the movement of people. We'll look at some of these things, to give guidance to jobs, to look at risk mitigation, tools and technologies, and so on. So in many ways, the government's not finished yet, but the government has done some of the big work, let's say, and now the responsibilities are moving quickly down to the organization, down to the leadership, to try to figure out how to resolve economic issues, supply chain issues, and also health and safety issues within the organization. And these are the things we're going to be looking at now. So I'm going to take you through our 6 consequences from the pandemic for organizations. And we're going to talk about some basics, some health and safety basics, which I think forms the core of this work. Obviously about remote work, and there's been other webinars produced on that, but I'm going to mention briefly some of the feedback we've been getting. Control issues around centralization of authority, politics raising their head in organizations, a big issue around connection and culture, the time horizons that the leaders take on the organization, on its future, and issues around leadership. We'll end off with that, and some modes of leadership, some things that leaders need to keep in mind when managing through a crisis. I want to thank the people who participated in the survey. This tells you some of the different industries or sectors that they came from. So a little bit of everything. The biggest two groups were finance, banking, insurance, real estate, and services. So about 40% of the survey, but otherwise spread out to different sectors. I did a very quick analysis using an algorithm, a natural language processing algorithm, to do something called sentiment analysis on the qualitative responses I had. The survey was strictly qualitative. People gave back some written comments about what they were experiencing. And what this analysis shows you is two things. Across the x-axis, you see polarity. So it's the extent to which people are positive or negative in the words that they choose. And subjectivity, which looks at whether they're using more opinion or fact when they're expressing themselves. And on the whole, people seem to be on the positive side. The average was about 0.1, mildly so, right? Not very positive, but slightly positive, and tended to be a little bit more factual than opinionated in how they presented things. But there is also a positive correlation between those two. As people became more factual in descriptions, they also became more negative in the tones. So just something to keep in the back of your mind. So the new basics. One thing to maybe leave on the side is that obviously there's a lot of concern over cash flows and the finances in the companies, and across the board people were saying that. But beyond that, some of the things companies have to deal with are health and safety, clearly, when people go back to work. And some of the things you were doing probably beforehand, before the lockdowns, hygiene, maybe temperature checks at the door, social distancing. But I think the next wave to come will be about more extensive job and office redesign. I think organizational designers or planners will have to go in and look at the density of different spaces of offices, if people come back at all. But when they do, looking at the density of those offices, trickling down the health policy recommendations and redesigning those. There's also a lot of attention to barriers, sort of a revenge of Dilbert. I thought we'd gotten away from the cubicled office, and we were moving more to a flat type of open space office with sofas and lots of communal spaces. The chances are we're going to have to reintroduce barriers of different sorts in order to increase perhaps some of the density of these working spaces. Movements, if there's a high congestion period in an organization, either in the morning or in the afternoon or during the lunch period, those may have to be broken up into different groups and so on. So some more detailed design issues for the office. And then the issue around testing, tracing, and isolation. So obviously this is being heavily done by governments, but organizations are also getting into this area as well. You've probably read about Amazon, who is prepared to test all of their workers. There's some concern that this may take away testing equipment from frontline workers and others. They're also building, it seems, a chemical laboratory of some sort to provide the testing equipment for those tests. It's not just big companies, though. In that other piece that you see there, the other article describes a relatively small delicatessen in Indianapolis, where the owner is also concerned about COVID spread amongst employees and is willing to invest in testing equipment and tests to keep employees safe. So clearly large companies will be doing this, but we also expect to see some small ones as well. It does have those challenges. Technically, you can't just do a nose swab in the hallway of your organization as people come in. Sometimes swabbing causes sneezing, which could lead to safety issues. There has to be somebody with the right equipment to do it and so on. So there will be expertise issues, there will be cost issues if companies go down that route. There's also issues around risk mitigation that companies will face. Every organization has some key resources or knowledge for which there may be relatively little substitution. And one question will be, how do you keep from having that entire knowledge set or that specialization going down and having to be isolated? This is a little bit strange because normally we tend to group specializations together. In our offices at INSEAD, the entire OB group sits in one area. And you can imagine if three of us all teach a high volume core course, you probably wouldn't want those people to be in regular contact with each other, because simply if all three of us have to be isolated, then it may have had knock-on effects for the organization. So there'll be risk mitigation issues also that the companies have to think about as well. The other area that we heard a lot from in the survey was around remote working lives. And clearly many of you are having to work from home. This is the most mentioned item on the survey that came back to us. One caveat, first of all, I think it's a little bit of a luxury for us to be able to work from home. Most of our jobs in the economy today, at least, cannot work from home. One recent survey in Norway in the United States found that only about 36 to 37% of the total amount of jobs can actually be done remotely or from home. So it is a little bit of a luxury for us to have that. And I'm also worried about looking at the quality of remote work during a pandemic. There's some things that may bias the results downwards. We have reduced social outlets in the evenings and on the weekends, and so remote work may become particularly onerous, or we have to manage kids in their schooling at home. There's other things that may actually increase the liking for remote work and make us more open to it. You know, we have a job. The alternative is not working from the office, but no work at all. So I think we have to be careful and control those results very, very carefully. The results in general, we seem to be divided. We seem to have this love-hate relationship with remote work. Some people clearly love it. They love to be able to get up in the morning and not have a very long commute, and start their morning immediately without 90 minutes on a train or in the car. Some hate it. They miss the social interactions. Just a few little anecdotes here. This is a story from a former student who is the CEO of Roadmap. They're a travel management company for business. And one of the founders posted online their story about the last couple of months, how they've experienced the pandemic. In the first paragraph is his own story, and he has a hard time. He says, "I'm a social animal. I need to surround myself with people. And so the past couple of months have been very difficult for him. My productivity has been very low." Whereas his colleague seems to be thriving and enjoying the experience more probably than regular working hours and regular office hours. From the survey as well, I see differences from participants. In the first one, the first quote there, you see that employees' behavior varied. Some engaged in it, appreciated it, thought that this was a wonderful way to work, and others took advantage of the situation, weren't performing, weren't productive, and so on. The second quote, that person has engaged very well to it, adapted pretty well to working remotely. My routine has actually changed for the better. I am happier. But as he or she goes on to say, others have had difficulty. Whether we like it or not, it does seem to be a structural shift. We just don't know yet how deep it will be. One survey from Deloitte that surveys fairly large companies, over 10 billion, their CFOs, 75% of them expect more remote work within the next year, in about a year's time. So they don't expect this certainly to go away. And nearly half of them expect to actually decrease their real estate footprint. So, this is partly a cost issue as well, potentially a cost savings for some, and a productivity issue for others. So on the whole, people have certainly been engaging with remote working. The challenges are the social interaction side. I know in one of my colleagues' surveys, this comes up strongly, that this was a factor in people not liking it as much. There's also issues around remote working conditions varying quite a bit. Unequal access to broadband, not having enough technical support, peace and focus, or lack of asynchronous work processes, where it's hard for people to work on a project or on a document asynchronously. So the challenges there will be to make sure that there's enough resources for remote work, enough support, and that the organization puts in place the tools and the processes to make this work. It's not the technology that's the problem. The technology is there. It's people having access to it and the systems to put it all together. Okay. So this brings us to the issue of control. And I'll just read you some of these comments from the survey. Senior executives wanting to be involved in all decision-making, empowerment has reduced. Our CEO widely perceived as shrewd, highly accountable and active, yet also extremely micromanaging and over-controlling. In some regards, I would say that the organization I work for has been compassionate, but at times brutal, redundancies, salary cuts, and in general, more demanding. So I think one thing that I'm seeing in the responses is that there is this strong tendency to centralize control, especially in this crisis. So let's look at that more generally. When crisis hits, we can think about two types of responses that people may have. One may be a more devolved approach, where that control is shared, because you might need expertise, knowledge in a certain area very quickly. There's the famous story of Apollo 13 in the Tom Hanks movie, some of you may have seen, where it was a technical issue, a technical crisis, and they rapidly needed the expertise of people all around the organization, NASA, to come back with solutions. So on the positive side, devolving control gives us lots of engagement. But when you have a crisis that's more about resource scarcity, when it's about drying up of cash flows and basic resources for the firm, then other type of issues may raise their head. One is tribalism, something that I've seen in talking to companies where you have a lot of politics that rise up. There's not as much action on the outside, and more of it turns inside as people protect their turf and try to make sure they get their share of the resources. And devolution may also lead to reduction in speed. Things sort of slow down. Perhaps the more natural reaction is a centralization of power, and we've seen quite a bit of that. What are the benefits? We've seen some studies around that where there are benefits. There's greater speed, greater clarity in some cases. This is also culturally dependent. There may be more reassurance in having more top-down control and more discipline. But there's a danger to it as well. Sometimes it will lead to greater distancing, greater power distance between people at the top and people down low. Lowering of input and sharing. People may actually stop to be locally creative and innovative and expect more from the top. And importantly, a loss of learning for executives, if not enough of the information is being channeled up. If people are freezing up and there's too much fear to share some of the things that they're seeing. What may also happen is that people stop focusing on the outside and start to focus more on the inside, which may lead to more of some of the negatives, some of the tribalism and so on. So what can companies do about this? It's a delicate balancing act to sort of thread the needle of control. I think some centralization is probably natural, especially in a resource scarcity type of crisis. One question is, can you specify a time frame? When will authority be relatively pulled in more tightly, and when will it perhaps bounce back, so people have a time frame on this? Secondly, can you clarify decision rights? What things will belong more exclusively to the center, and what things you absolutely need approval for, but what things do you expect people to make local decisions on? I know in one company I've spoken to, there's a lot of unclarity over who decides what. And at the moment, the people at the top are overburdened. There's just too many decisions going up their way, and they can't handle them. So they're having to clarify the decision rights and who has to decide on what issues. Many of you have had some instruction in fair process leadership, which tends to be a more of a bottoms-up model. I think it's still relevant. I think you may have to work through the different phases or stages much more quickly than in the past. But it's still important to consider some of those different phases, even if you have to work through them fairly quickly. Keep in mind one thing in particular, that decisions still require explanations. Normally, when we work through a decision, we can do scoping and engaging with people, perhaps brainstorming, and the explanation is inherent in that process. People sort of see why we're doing this. Now, when decisions are coming rapidly from the top, the onus is on leaders to provide more of that explanation about why we're doing this. And one way to frame it that I think is very important is some research on this that shows the importance of a institutional framing to the decisions. How does this help the whole institution in keeping people focused on the welfare and of the good of the whole? For example, one thing that may be useful to do is before locally people in departments or areas make requests for resources, they should preface their request with, this move or idea helps the whole of the organization because, and have an answer to that. And then most of all, I think it's important for leaders, even as they do pull up the decision rights and centralize some of that control, is that they're also making sure that they're updating themselves, that they're continuing to pull up information and make sure they know the pulse of the organization, what's happening in different places in the organization. So I think before I go on to the next part, and maybe we'll take a pause there. We're about halfway through and take some questions.
Yes, great. I see a lot of questions coming in, so let me just pick a few. Let's go back to maybe the remote working and the first two. You were saying it's companies need to put a lot of health and safety into place. They want to bring employees back in the office. It requires new layout of the office. So there was one provocative question. Wouldn't it be easier just to accept the remote working as the new normal and give employees the personal tools they need, the internet access? Wouldn't that be an easier way? Just accept and push forward instead of trying to go backwards.
That's a great question. And I encourage whoever asked the question also to look at my colleague Fanish produced a great webinar just on this. And this is the areas he's been looking at. It's certainly the new normal in that we're going to see higher percentages of people working remotely. And I think that's potentially a good thing. There's lots of things that we lose with that. And that's in fact the next thing I'm going to go into in a moment, the loss of connection and what that means. But yes, I think companies should embrace this and make sure that they have the tools in place and the processes, especially for people to somehow substitute for the randomness of being co-located, where they can quickly brainstorm issues. How can we substitute that while working online? Because often getting access to somebody remotely may not be as easily as walking across the corridor and having a conversation. But yes, I think this is the new normal and we should definitely get ready for it.
And one other, you have talked about the story of two tales. Some really, really adore and have embraced the remote working. Others are really struggling. As a leader, as a manager, how do you deal that you have different audiences, different type of employees? It's very black and white. So what do you do moving forward?
Yeah, no, good question. I think one of the things that I'd like to know is why there's differences between them. Is it because they're lacking, first of all, the basic resources? If you're trying to work from home and you don't have, your bandwidth is very low, or your technology is not what you have in the office. In the office, you may have a monitor or a couple of monitors or whatever else. And at home, you're working on an old laptop where the image is sort of fuzzy, and you're having to spend 8 hours like that or 9 hours, then that's something companies need to be aware of, because this is a basic support that they're going to have to offer. So one thing to look at is the variability in people's working conditions at home, and do they have the right tools and support systems in place. There's maybe other differences to do with how people are wired. And I'm not sure how to overcome that. I think there's some things for which we still will very much need presence and people to be together. So I think it's some hybrid solution that will be needed. But I would start by looking at the variance of locally of people remotely working and what sort of conditions they're working under.
And maybe a last question. It may touch already something of what you want to cover later, but here a provocative question again. Have companies become more political as a result of COVID-19?
Well, I think I'm getting stories that are very varied. It's sort of a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde syndrome. I think some companies will walk away from this. They'll survive financially. but they will be very, very scarred, because the way this is being managed is leading to lots of tribalism and lack of clarity, and there's a feeling of panic and so on. And I think their cultures will suffer down the road. Other places, I'm seeing much more encouraging things where they're using these as moments to create solidarity. They're taking care of each other, their self-sacrifice. So I think the experience of this is what I'm seeing, at least, is very varied. And then hopefully leaders will get this right and use this as a moment to really bring people together. So why don't I go on to these type of themes, and then we'll come back to the questions. So I hope this is working again. Oh, is this back? All right. So the fourth theme is around connection. And this is also one of the most powerful ones that I've been hearing both from colleagues and from the responses in the survey. The pandemic, first of all, for me is a massive centrifugal force. It's sort of a separating force. And you think about all of these things we're doing: social distancing, split teams, remote work, centralization vertically, tribalism horizontally. It's undermining a lot of trust that organizations have. And people, in essence, are missing more of a connection with one another. Let me break that down a bit, because I think the connection comes in several forms. One basic way is that we're missing connection in terms of information. There's perhaps a decline in the flow of information. A lovely quote here: "We realize that we rely a lot on informal networks and conversations, which means suddenly information is not going through and things don't get done." So we're trying to substitute this with remote means, with Zoom and Teams and everything else, but it's not easy. There's also this magic of randomness, of contacting somebody on the spur of the moment, and because you see them, because you have a coffee together, and having that exchange, and that seems to be in decline as well. It's not that we can't substitute this yet with remote ways, but it's going to take a lot of work to get there. We're also missing some of the social bonds, some of the collective energy from being co-located, right? I think that this is missing. Another quote there: "People are yearning to hear the pulse of the organization, which would normally be through corridor talk and is now absent." I think we also miss the richness of social exchange. For some type of problems that are particularly intense or complex, we may need particularly long-lasting and frequent social exchange. And again, that's harder to find these days. I think some people also miss the stage. Human life has various stages: our home life, the hobbies that we're part of, our old high school friends, whatever else, and we have our organizations, and our roles and our identities are partly based on that stage at work, and I know some people are missing that. There's also issues of connection to do with equity and inclusion. Equity in the sense of is the pain of the pandemic, of the downturn, shared equally or shared somehow. I love this one quote. Somebody said on the consequences of the pandemic: "Fear, mainly, especially of lower qualified employees. Leadership level managed the crisis very well." Now, I don't know if they meant that authentically or whether it was sarcastically, but you be the judge of that. And the second point around inclusion: do people have an opportunity to play a role, to take part and to belong? One alumni, I'm guessing here, wrote, "I'm the owner of the business, and I decided to self-fund the organization and avoid furlough and job losses. The team have rallied behind me, and in more than one case, people offered to receive less pay." Very emotional times for me. So a nice example of sacrifice, which is reciprocated and is creating a powerful moment of solidarity and collectiveness for this organization. And another quote: "We have seen also some very nice signs of generosity and solidarity." So for some companies that are managing to create that sense of inclusion and people being able to show care for one another and sacrifice, it's a powerful opportunity to bring people together at this time. So some ideas around connection, right? The obvious one: lots of communication, but I think also courage from leaders to go out and to really talk and communicate to people. That's not easy to do. There's a lot of negative response they may get from people about their situation, and And having the courage to go out and listen is something that's important for leaders to show right now. I think it's also important to develop a narrative. Your story about the pandemic and the experience of the organization. What is the story that this organization has for how you hope to get out of this, right? What's the strategy for emerging from this? Do people know that? How is this connected to the culture? You've spent years probably developing an organizational culture, various investments there. This is the time to leverage that, some of those institutions that you've built, and to use those to help bring people together during the pandemic. And again, giving people an opportunity to show care, to show involvement and sacrifice. As one other person said, in general, I have the feeling that people are taking more care of each other, setting a positive tone around what's possible here. So I think it's up to leaders to avoid the bad scenario, which is a tribal, faction-filled organization where people are not focused on the outside, where they're focused more on internal resources and making sure they get as much as they can for their units or themselves, and instead helping create more solidarity and connection within the organization. There's also a tension around competing time horizons. So clearly there's a lot of attention on managing the crisis, which is about short-term optics, the here and now, focusing on immediate financial health and efficiency and control. It's about cutting and stopping things and so on, and a lot of that going on, of course. But there should also be attention to managing for the future, using this shock as an occasion to do something different with the organization. Opportunities for rethinking basics, exploring, learning, and so on. I like this one quote, the first quote that you see there, where the person said, "Now people have an open mind when thinking about the future. They are free to imagine how the company should look like in the future." And normal performance sometimes is very inertial. It sort of drives us to continue doing the exact same thing. I think in this case with the setbacks, it's made them braver to re-examine how they might organize themselves alternatively. Let me give you one quick example of that from a company that you may not know them, but you certainly know their products. BMG, this is Bertelsmann Music Group. And around 2000, this was one of the largest music groups in the world. They did the broad portfolio of things in the music industry, from A&R, that's artists and repertoire, development of the acts, finding the acts, promotion, publishing, making sure the copyrights are respected, collecting the cash, distribution, and so on. But with the internet coming along, digital revolution, music going on stream, what they did over the course of about 10 years, or probably more like in about 4 or 5 year period, is they morphed into a strictly digital company. They said the thing that we're going to focus exclusively on is digital rights management, digital publishing. So if you have written a song, or if you recorded a song, you need somebody to help you track that song on Spotify or Apple Music and make sure that you're being paid for that song's use. And today they're in the top 4 in the world in that area. So sort of really morphed and used the crisis to do something completely different. Well, to focus on an area. So what can companies do about this? One is that to understand that it's not an either or question. Those competing logics, managing the crisis and managing the future. There's some great work by one of my colleagues, Ella Spector, on paradoxical thinking, on the importance of holding things that seem contradictory, but trying to find a balance point between them. There's also some great work in a literature called organizational ambidexterity, which looks at structural solutions to balancing these contradictions, focusing both on efficiency and on exploration. And I encourage you to look at some of that literature, may be very useful. And finally, some caution, some of the structures that people build over the next couple of months or next couple of, maybe the next year or two, are not necessarily good for the long term. These should be things that maybe get us through this time, but then look to change those structures and processes to really adapt to the way the future will look, especially if remote working becomes more of a mainstream. Okay, so I think we'll stop there and take some more questions before going to the last one, Anna.
Very good. Your chapter Connections provoked a couple of questions. On a practical level, if I focus on connections, should I focus on establishing connections within the teams or trying to attack the silo, so between different teams, not within?
I would like to see people trying to bridge the teams. I think what probably happens naturally is that the teams themselves are able to collect themselves very rapidly during this time, because that's the unit you're always with or well. And so it becomes a little bit easier to connect remotely because you've had so much physical presence together. I think the difficulty is with people that you don't see so normally and you don't have the connections to. So I would look for bridging across those and make sure there's enough coordination across the different units.
That makes sense. And then what about local subsidiaries versus head office? Is it now time to push connection, or should you be cautious about local independence?
Cautious about local independence. I'm trying to look. I think during this time, it's also important to be a good follower. I think you have to allow the leadership to do their job and to try to. They have to listen, but they have to collect the strategy and the views and bring it together. I would look for them to set some time frame and explain the decision rights. What things can we do locally? What things are you subsuming under headquarters? But I think in a crisis moment, we also have to allow the central leaders to do their role. But then with the expectation is that they will devolve authority and clarify things as we go through.
Okay. And then moving on to your ambidexterity, I think that created a lot of interest. How do you do this in practice? Does that mean you create different leadership teams, one focusing more on the crisis, the other more looking ahead, or can you explain a bit more?
Well, it's a large literature. There's lots of different parts to it. I think one of the main tools that they look at is structural tools. So, small is beautiful. Small speedboats that can go out, that can allow the rest of the organization to operate with efficiency, focus, or mindedness. But have these units go out and test and try different things very rapidly with some resources, some support, and then finding the right moment to graft that back into the organization, make sure that gets picked up in different places. So that seems to be one favorite way to do this. There's other ways to do this a little bit more simultaneously. But again, there's a lot of things to cover there, and I encourage people to look at that literature. There's lots been written in that regard. In fact, what we can do is I can post some articles and some suggestions for people to read.
That would be great. And then maybe let's move on to the last, so that we still have some time for
All right.
Maybe one of the most exciting chapters, actually.
All right, so let me go back to the screen sharing. Okay, are we back? All right. So the last area is around leadership or leadership modes during the crisis, and maybe begin with a little story of the Stockdale paradox. Some of you who've read the work of Jim Collins, Good to Great, will be familiar with this. James Stockdale was a Navy fighter pilot who was a prisoner of war and spent 7 to 8 years and survived that period, managed to get out in the end. And many people were asking, well, how did you manage to survive? How did you stay sane? And he said, I had two things that I had to rely upon. One is unwavering faith and hope that we will get through this, that I will get through this. But secondly, also confronting the brutal facts, not allowing optimism to, inflate my hopes, and then when things don't happen the way I want them to, being deflated and depressed about the situation. I think in general, it's a very good model for leadership as well. And other people have said this, apparently Napoleon, the leader's role is to define reality and then give hope. But it's finding that balance between being brutal with the facts and being honest about the reality, but at the same time inspiring people and giving them hope. There's a great example today from Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, and many people jumping on her bandwagon. She's done remarkable things last year in leading the country through the crisis. over the Christchurch mosque shootings, and then again through the COVID crisis. And there's two things that she combines. One is inspiration. I hope that is sincere, that's very believable and delivered with understanding and care. But at the same time, she's somebody who is realistic, who's brutal with the facts, and is willing to confront the reality in the situation and doesn't mince her words and seems to be honest about those things. There's a lovely quote about her from The Atlantic. Her messages are clear, consistent, and somehow simultaneously sobering and soothing. So this connection between the two. I think in general, this is what I would encourage leaders to do. The way I think about it is leadership is played out on a stage. There's of course front stage work, and we've spent probably 20 years of coaching and training managers to be more effective on the front stage, from emotional intelligence to storytelling capabilities, their visibility, their style, their presence, and so on. So lots of work being done there. But leaders also have to be good at that backstage work, at guiding certain core processes of the organization and making sure that these work, that they will function well, that you're aware of the difficulties people are having, that you're brutally honest about the organization and truthful about what's going on down below, and that you shape those processes so that they're working at the best levels that your resources can afford. So for me, leaders who will do the best through this will be working across these two boundaries, across this boundary between the front stage moments of inspiration and hope, but also working hard at the backstage, making sure they understand what the reality is, and making sure they hone in on these processes. And by core processes, I mean things like working on the organizational culture, working on scanning of the environment, making sure you've got good systems to pick up the next hurricane, sense making for the organization, driving that down, mobilizing people, fair process routines, and so on. So with that, Anev, we can open it up to questions, if you'd like, the last 10 minutes or so.
So it's great that you picked Jacinda as an example. There was one comment, especially that you, so she's great front stage, but someone said it wasn't part of her success also that she did great policy. She very early on recognized the risk, closed, I think, in New Zealand for flights from China. So it's not just front stage that she's doing great, but also the backstage piece seemed to have been quite important. So before you explain it, there was immediately the comment, hold on, there are two pieces that need to go together. And I think she's probably a great example of those. Are there companies that you would pick as a great example for front stage and backstage leaders?
Yes, there's many leaders who I think do this well, without necessarily naming companies, but there's one company I'm working with now, and there's a lot of detailed, heavy lifting going on in the background to figure out their context. And it's been going on before this crisis. They were doing this vis-a-vis the environment, right? Maybe the next crisis that we may face as a crisis, but they were looking at the implications for the environment, for their business model and their products, and it would have substantial impact if certain environmental regulations come into place and the world changes that way. They're doing a lot of backstage work around that, and at the same time they're developing a campaign around how to communicate this to people and how to slowly shift the organization. I think another good example, if you want somebody that's more visible, is Indra Nooyi from Pepsi, who stepped into Pepsi at a time when it wasn't obvious how important nutrition would become, more nutritional products. This is something she certainly sensed, and she was working with scientists and other experts in that area, in the backstage, making sure that products would be developed. But then she also had a very strong presence front stage in moving the organization, in mobilizing people and making sure they understood the story behind Pepsi and where it was trying to go. So for me, that's another great example of a leader that was able to move between back and front stage and deal with not a crisis of these proportions, but a different sort of issue, an industry crisis that was on the horizon, and start to shift the organization even before that crisis fully hits.
Another question linked to that. If I'm not the CEO, but somewhere in the middle to senior management, how do I communicate that brutal honesty that is required vis-a-vis my superiors that may not always go down so well?
Okay. Yeah, not an easy issue if the top, by not going down so well, it may mean that the top is not prepared to listen. Look,
Yes,
in many ways, it has to start from the top. Top has to be willing to be engaged. I think if you don't have that, there's a couple of things. Hopefully, your chain of command is able to filter that, or not filter excessively, but pass on those messages back up. The other thing that gets attention is mobilization of numbers. You know, one person may not get a lot of attention, but if several people form a coalition and they can bring a message together, it's more likely to be heard.
Very good. Charlie, there's so many more questions. I know you have a new book coming up about the backstage leadership. I'd love to ask you more. Maybe we have 2 more minutes. Do you want to say a bit more? So I know that the book is really explaining in more detail how important it is to lead from the back so that you're actually able to influence and then shape direction, shape capabilities. Do you want to say a bit more and give people an incentive to read? Because I think it's a very important piece, and as you say, it's often underestimated.
Sure. So it's not the purpose is to talk about the book, but I think my experience is when we talked about things front stage, I think people got it, and we've invested so much into coaching, to personal leadership development. And it doesn't just deal with front stage stuff. It deals with some backstage issues as well, but it's mostly front stage. It's about style and listening skills and interpersonal skills and storytelling skills and a lot of things of that nature. But what I found missing in the executives that I was helping develop is that there wasn't enough knowledge about some core backstage processes that you need to make sure you're, first of all, totally aware of how good they are. And secondly, that you have a hand in shaping them, because at some point, as you move up, you will not be able to influence people directly, or not in volume, right? You cannot talk to everybody except through, you know, projections like this. But to really influence their daily behavior, it's going to require some secondary influences, meaning that you have to make sure that these invisible forces around the organization, these basic processes, are working well. And so in this book that I've been writing for the last couple of years, I've been trying to codify these processes, give some examples, give not recipes, but some ideas for what to do as well. And that's what the book is about. It's about collecting these backstage processes together. There's also some attention to front stage skills as well in the very end of the book, but it's mostly about the backstage.
Great. Charlie, thank you so much. We are close to the hour, so we have to finish it here. Really appreciate your insight, the time you've taken, and to show us some of the consequences we should think about as we move out of this pandemic. Just a few announcements towards the end. Please continue the conversation if you like what we have kicked off here on the lifelong learning site on LinkedIn. You are able to leave your comments there, and as I say, you can continue the discussion. Also, please check out our upcoming webinars. And last but not least, feedback is very, very important. It will take 30 seconds, probably. It's 4 questions. After the webinar, we send you a quick email. Please fill it in. It's would be very much appreciated. With that, I wish you a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you very much for joining us again, and hope to see you soon on one of our digital platforms, or hopefully at some point soon also again in